It was 1960, England, and the Irish gypsy that had visited him before his arrest had promised him immortality. Frankie Lewis had been in hiding since he'd shot a woman dead, whom he was convinced had given him away to police. He'd been told that she'd grassed him. His criminal contacts had figured the woman called Ellie, an attractive and petite woman that worked behind the bar of a local pub. It was well known that she was on the police payroll as an informant and had been instrumental in the arrest of many criminals. In pubs, people got drunk, and when criminals got drunk, they talked. She would engage them and then pass on their slurred speech confessions to the police. The next day, they would get arrested. But before her cover was blown, Frankie had got to her. She wasn't going to get him arrested. No way. He was going to have the drop on her, and did. When she had grassed up his friend, Tommy Davis, for doing a smash-and-grab raid on a high-street jeweller's, he'd got 5 years. 5 lousy years. One by one, he had seen friends and associates jailed. And after he hit the bank and got away with £2,000, he decided to run and leave the town. But Ellie had been talking. When the police came for him, he'd taken to the streets and waited for Ellie in the shadows of the alleyway near the back door that she used to leave after her working day. At 10 o'clock sharp, as the locals were gently being shunted out of the pub, Ellie was getting ready to leave. She had slipped on a heavy leopard print coat and had said goodbye to the pub landlord, Harry, and then left. She had walked through the backyard, past the mounted beer crates and empty bottles, and had opened the gate. Frankie had been standing in the darkness, a small Colt automatic in his hands. She was just starting down the alley towards him when he stepped out of the shadows and fired once, twice, and then a third time. 3 slugs had slammed into her jerking body and had knocked her back against the wall. She had clutched her chest, the blood gushing through her fingers. She had gazed at the blood on her hands in shattered disbelief, knowing that she was going to die. He had watched her stagger forward towards him, and in the vague illumination of a nearby bedroom light from across the alley, she had recognized him and pointed a finger in accusation at him, just as he gave her a 4th bullet and fled up the alleyway. Ellie had fallen onto her side, her body crashed and knocked a dustbin over. She died with her face buried in a week's worth of accumulated rubbish. Frankie ran and pushed past a departing customer. The man, startled, saw his face as he tore past him. Cursing, Frankie ran towards the railway station, just as the last trainer got in. The man had seen him, recognized him. How had he been there? Why had he been the last to leave so late? He swiftly bought a ticket for the city and then settled into a carriage and kept away from the windows. Relieved he'd found an empty compartment, he felt lucky. Yet he couldn't get the look of Ellie's face out of his mind. Her horrified expression, and the finger of doom that she had pointed at him, and her agonized death seemed to affect him. Nothing had bothered him like this, not in the past. He was a career criminal, brutal, violent. He had hurt many people. It was all part of his work. People got hurt. It happened. But he couldn't get her out of his head. Her face, her anguished death. He felt himself starting to sweat and tried to think of getting away, out of the country, anywhere. He arrived in the city and looked for a hotel that looked cheap. He knew the city well and made his way down towards the canal. He paced its edge, then, checking to see if the coast was clear, sent the Colt spinning into the dirty water. It made a small splash and vanished. He watched a couple of bubbles rise to the surface and, satisfied that it would never be found, ran away. He took a room for the night at a run-down guest house, and when he got in his room, he took off his raincoat and dropped his bag. He flopped back onto the bed like a spent force, feeling weak and drained. And then he groaned as he thought of the man he'd bumped into, the man who had seen his face, one of the pub regulars. He thought if only he had been smarter, had worn a mask, had planned it all better, then it wouldn't have turned out so bad. But he hadn't worn a mask. He'd been so insanely intent on exacting revenge that he'd overlooked even the smallest details of the job. And now he was jammed, real good. He cursed and swore, but it was too late. He'd killed the girl and he'd been seen running from the alley. The reality of the situation seemed to burden him, and he rolled onto his side. As he drifted off to sleep, he saw Ellie's face once again, and as she faded into darkness, he saw the hangman and the black bag being placed over his head, and heard the snap of the trapdoor as it was sprung. The crack of his neck bones jolted him awake. He woke up with a start. He was in the hotel room, on a squeaking bed. The mattress was bare and the covers were thin, cheap, and someone was knocking on the door. The room was murky and the dawn was just starting to rise. In panic, he leapt up. He flattened himself against the wall and edged towards the door. The knock came again, more forcibly this time. "Who is it?" said Frankie cautiously. "Who's there?" "A friend," said the soft Irish voice. "I'm here to help you." "What do you want?" said Frankie, as he reached over and picked up an empty vase off the drawer. He clutched it in his right hand, ready to use it as a club. With his left hand he held the doorknob. "Mr. Lewis, I haven't got all day," said the Irish voice. "We need to be quick." Frankie held the vase tightly and flipped the catch. He opened the door a crack and peered out. The man was small. He was no taller than 5'1", and he wore a shabby-looking jacket. He had an open-neck shirt and a knotted tie round his neck. He looked like a fairground worker, a barker. His face was ruddy as if he'd run up the stairs, yet he wasn't out of breath. He looked friendly, but Frankie still held the vase close. "What do you want? How do you know me?" "I just do. Now, are you going to spend what little time you have left standing there with a vase in your hand?" Frankie felt ridiculous, and he let the little man into his room. The Irishman sat down on the bed. It made a sorry squeak. He sighed as he looked at Frankie. God, what a depressing room this was. "The man who you bumped into has spoken to the police. He recognized you. They're just outside the hotel," said the little man as he casually produced some tobacco and papers. Frankie ran to the window. The little Irishman was right. 3 police Wolsleys had pulled into the curb and police officers raced from the cars. "See, I told you they were here," said the little man as he rolled the cigarette with amazing adroitness. It was as if the cigarette had been made with a flash of his fingers. He lit it and blew out some smoke. "Oh, shit," cursed Frankie. "Oh, hell. I bet you wished you hadn't dished that lovely little Colt automatic of yours, Frankie. It was a nice gun, that was. Pearl handle, too, very nice." Again, the Irishman was right. He wished he hadn't thrown the Colt. But how did he know it had a pearl handle? He was stuck, unarmed, and blocked in. It looked as if the hotel was surrounded. "Don't worry, I can help you," said the little man with all the effortless ease of one who was enjoying a relaxing day. "Just sit here beside me. Sit down and listen." Frankie locked the door when he heard the police downstairs. He heard footsteps. They sounded heavy on the stairway. Loads of size 10s and 11s. They were all racing towards his room. "Come here," the little man commanded, and Frankie sheepishly did. The Irishman gripped the side of his head, a smoking cigarette still in his mouth. He muttered something, an ancient sound. It sounded Celtic, archaic. It sounded like a pagan incantation. Frankie felt the jolt of something leap into his head, and he fell back. He crashed against the wall. As he hit the ground, he heard the police hammering on the door. "Lewis, open up. This is the police," an aggressive voice cried. "Open up or we'll kick it in." Frankie lay there as the little Irishman smiled. He blew out a stream of smoke. "Now, Frankie, nothing can hurt you," he said wisely. "You are immortal. They cannot harm you. No rope can kill you. Nothing can kill you. The words seemed to trail away, and as they did, so did the Irishman. It was as if the diminutive man just misted into his own cigarette smoke. It was like he was never there. The door crashed open as the lock broke, and 3 police officers burst into the room. They were so huge that they made the room look even smaller. They moved aside as the detectives swept in. "Francis Anthony Lewis, I'm arresting you for the murder of..." Well, that was weeks ago. It took the jury less than an hour to find him guilty of the murder of Eleanor Grace O'Brien. It had been unanimous. All 12 had found him guilty, and so the verdict was delivered. The judge sat in grim silence as the black cap was placed upon his head, his eyes stolidly fixed upon the condemned man. Frankie closed his eyes as the sentence was gravely spoken. There was nothing left to say. "You shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy upon your soul. Take him down." He sat in the condemned cell for 3 weeks. He sat smoking and reading, and passing what little time he had left chatting to the 2 prison officers. They'd been friendly enough, conversational, and they'd kept him calm and relaxed. But it was their job to keep him calm. Of course, he had mentioned the Irishman at his trial, but the prosecution had dismissed it as a weak ploy, a lie to claim madness as a defence. No one had believed his tale about a mysterious little man from the Emerald Isle. The doctors had declared him sane and fit for execution. On his final night, he lay on his bed, smoking. Smoke drifted languidly up towards a dull grey ceiling. Grey, he thought. Bloody prison regulation grey. How apt for the penal system to choose such a colour, how appropriate, as if the concept was designed to create an atmosphere of defeat and misery. To await your own murder by the state was one thing, but putting up with that lousy flat grey was another pisser. He suddenly thought about the Irishman. He remembered his words and his promise of immortality. Had he been truthful? Was it true that the rope and the drop through the trap would be useless against him? Could such a mystical chant make him impervious to death? But then, had the little man actually existed? Frankie lay there, feeling confused. He tried to believe in the Irishman. If he couldn't be hung, they'd have to free him. Free him. He remembered the incantations, the chants, brief and swift and ancient, almost disturbing. A strange droning mantra that seemed to penetrate his mind. For the first time in his evil life, Frankie closed his eyes and silently prayed. He begged not to die. He was actually begging not to die. He'd slept well. The night had drifted into dawn and he was slapped awake by one of the guards. He dressed, washed and shaved. He wore his suit, the shirt open, no tie. The brogues polished. He had a last smoke. He was offered a last whiskey, and he drank it fast. It hit the back of his throat and he coughed. It was a damned fine whiskey. It had been too good to be rushed like that, but he knew he didn't have much time left. Someone behind him suddenly said, "It's time." He felt a set of hands push him against the wall. The sudden force of their handling made him resist on instinct, but he was swiftly overpowered. His wrists were bound, and he had the cigarette removed from his mouth as he was ushered towards the noose. A door opened, and there it was. The rope hung like a lonely loop, the heavy tube slipknot ready to snap his neck. The trap directly below him. He was placed upon it. "Have you any last words to say before sentence is carried out?" "Would it matter?" said Frankie defiantly to the hangman, a sneer curling on his lips. "Nah, I've nothing to say." "Proceed." The hood was placed over Frankie's head. The death chamber was plunged into darkness. He heard the sounds of his breathing, the rhythm quickening as he waited for the drop. The adrenaline fired and kicked his heart. "What are you waiting for, you sadistic bastards? Pull the trap. Pull the bastard," he thought. Had he waited any longer, he would have screamed for them to pull the lever. And then they did, and he fell into nothingness. The bulbous knot jolted against his neck, and he was gone. And then all was darkness. He opened his eyes. It was darkness, all darkness. His neck seemed to be making cracking noises as if it was resetting itself. Bones knitted and clicked and joined. He moved his head from side to side. The stiffness morphed into wellness. He tried to move, but he couldn't. He was fixed in place, unable to move much. Annoyed at his constricted movement, he began to holler. It was a tight fit and he couldn't move his limbs. He soon realized that he was in a coffin. He kicked and clawed at the lid, but it made no difference. He couldn't budge it. Realizing he was buried in the confines of the prison, as all executed people were, he started to scream. Fear raged through his mind. This wasn't right. He was supposed to be free to breathe fresh air and enjoy the sunlight. He had nothing but darkness. A voice, a familiar Irish voice, spoke to him as if the person was sitting right beside him. "Did I not promise you immortality, Frankie?" said the Irishman proudly. "Are you not amazed?" "Please get me out of here," cried Frankie in a panic. "Get me out of here, help me." "Oh, I promised to give you immortality," said the Irishman calmly. "I never said anything about getting you out of a coffin. And you are in a coffin, buried 6 foot down. They buried you just above a murderer called Jimmy Fletcher, I understand." "Please," cried Frankie, "get me out of here." The Irishman began to tut. "I never did introduce myself during that brief meeting we had, Frankie, but I shall do now. My name is Patrick O'Brien. O'Brien. And you murdered my daughter Ellie. My sweet little Ellie. So, I hope you remember that name forever. But then, I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will." Frankie panicked and began kicking at the coffin lid. "Patrick! Patrick!" But the voice had gone. "Patrick!" Frankie lay there in his coffin. His fingers bloodied and his knuckles bruised. He lay there, and he gently began to sob. He was blessed with the gift of immortality and an eternity to enjoy it.